All right, everybody. Was lost in thought there for a second. Good evening. It's good to see everybody tonight. We are going to continue our discussion in the book of Job. If I can turn this mic on. There we are. There we go. But before we do that, we're going to have Brother Eddie Dickey come up and lead us in a word of prayer. And then we are going to jump back into our study. I want to welcome everybody online too. We appreciate your presence as well. If we have anybody from Springdale tonight, we appreciate you being here as well. We are thankful for being able to broadcast to you folks out in West Virginia. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Brother Eddie.
To the people in Springdale, we used to live in Boomer for 5 years. Let's bow. Mighty God, most wonderful Father, we thank you for the blessings you give us every day. We thank you for the opportunities to be together and to study. We thank you for our brothers and sisters here and in the world over. We pray your blessings upon them. Guide us through the study. Guide us as we study your word from day to day. Help us to do your will always, and forgive us, Father, for we know sometimes we stumble. Give us the strength and fill us with your spirit that we might overcome. These things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Eddie. Well, tonight we're starting to get towards kind of somewhat of the closing sections. We still have a lot to cover. We have effectively covered Job, his complaint, his charge against God, which is effectively boiling down to why could this happen? Why did this happen to me? Why would God allow such a thing to happen to me? And then his defense against his friends, saying he has nothing to repent of. His three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, are attacking him with the idea that you had to have done something to deserve this. This can't have happened to you at random. Both groups seem to be very confused by the idea that God could potentially, seeming to their own standards, unjustly punish someone like Job. Job is confused by this. He doesn't want to think that about God, but that's the idea he's struggling with. He's more on the fence about it than they are, versus the three friends saying that, well, he definitely couldn't have done that, so you must, if we have to pick between you doing something to deserve what you did and God hypothetically, unjustly doing this to you, we're picking the first one. Now, the problem is that they're both wrong. That God doesn't unjustly punish his people because, number one, Job isn't being punished. He is being used by his Creator as a created being to prove a point, to fulfill his larger goal. And number two, God really kind of can't, if it does punish you, there's no injustice there because, well, we all deserve it. So, because of how much more righteous God is. So we're seeing one man's struggle with bad theology play out. We're seeing a group of three men who do love Job trying to wrestle with their bad theology to make it float when it doesn't want to. And then we're going to go later on after, beginning next week, we're going to go into a discussion over this sudden third party that comes in by the name of Elihu, a younger man than the four friends involved in the debate, who inserts himself at a quiet point, one of the few quiet points, and takes up several chapters. I think it's about 5 or 6 chapters, detailing his problems, because he's apparently been listening this whole time, and he has problems with what Job is saying, but he has a whole lot of problems with what Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar are saying, And he kind of inserts a third option, a third opinion. And it's really interesting because he might be the one who's right, but there are some interesting things that he says as well that makes you go, I don't know about that. And then finally, of course, we have God's own intercession and him coming in and really stirring up the pot. And we know he's right in his opinions. And he'll kind of explain to Job what's going on here, but not in a way that Job's curiosity finds satisfactory. But before we do that, before we get into that whole big mess, which is just as much material as we've covered up to this point, this kind of represents kind of a halfway point tonight. Now is a good time to talk about the weird stuff in Job. The really odd things in Job. Two in particular that we're going to focus on tonight, and then I'm going to be taking questions from all of you after our stream is over to see if you have any other weird stuff in your reading, because what I hope you're doing is, because we're taking a kind of a bird's eye view of Job, I hope you're reading it on your own. I hope you're going home and you're reading it verse by verse to kind of get the whole story in your daily Bible reading, not to just wait for Sunday night to when I can explain it to you one small chunk at a time. So if any of you have any questions or if you'd like to throw in some theories, because that's what tonight is about. Theories. I want to be clear about something. What I'm about to share with you, no one in this room, myself included, has any way of proving the correct interpretation, because it's really strange, some things that are said here. It references some things that are confusing to the modern Christian. And there are plenty of people out there who want to come up and say, well, I know exactly what they're saying. I know exactly what's being said here. This is definitely the interpretation, and any other interpretation is wrong. When we're talking about things like we're going to be talking about tonight, anybody that tells you that they definitely know what this is about and what it's referring to is either lying or they are deluded. I try to think it's the latter, that it's just hubris and naivete, just kind of shoehorning this interpretation because they're looking for some sense of normalcy. Because if anything, Job is not a normal book of the Bible. It's kind of like Revelation. This is the Old Testament version of Revelation, except for certain chunks of Daniel that read exactly like Revelation does. But really, Revelation's the same way. If somebody comes up to you and says, well, this is definitely how Revelation is supposed to be interpreted across the board in every little instance, that's disingenuous. And if it's not disingenuous, it's downright nefarious. Because, listen, I've been studying the Bible for a very, very long time. We've got some men in here, some women in here that have been studying it even longer than I have. And I think that all of us can kind of, what experts we seem to have in the room can probably come to the conclusion that there are chunks, as many times as I've read Revelation, and I've taught it dozens of times, there are chunks in Revelation that I straight up don't know what John is referring to. I have no idea what John is talking about. People ask me, he's like, well, what does this verse mean? And I kind of have to go, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's this. That's how I like to handle topics like this that we're going to see in Job tonight, because it's very similar in that regard. I don't like giving you my opinion, one-to-one answer, to say that this is definitely what's going on here, or this is what I think is most likely going on here. I'd rather give you some options. I might tell you which one I prefer, but whichever option sounds the best to you, if you like it, Bob's your uncle. So, the first one of the two that we're going to be covering tonight is Job's view of the afterlife. Now, we've already talked about this a little bit. We've referenced it somewhat, but now we're going to dig into it a little bit more. If you go here to Job chapter 14, Job chapter 14, he's going to be wishing for death here. We've already talked about the lowness of Job, the depression of Job. he says here, starting in verse 7, something really confusing to the modern Christian reader. Verse 7, for there is hope for a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoots will not cease, though its roots grow old in the earth, and its stump die in the soil, yet at the scent of water it will bud, and put out branches like a young plant. But a man dies and is laid low. Man breathes his last, and where is he? As waters fall from a lake, and a river wastes away and dries up, so a man lies down and rises not again. Till the heavens are no more, he will not awake, or be roused from his sleep. Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol. By the way, for those of you keeping notes, Sheol is the Hebrew word for the realm of the dead, or the land of the dead. Okay? That you would conceal me until your wrath be past. Your wrath being God's wrath. That you would appoint me a set time and remember me. Verse 14, if a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my service I would wait till my renewal should come. You would call, and I would answer you. You would long for the work of your hands. Then you would number my steps. You would not keep watch over my sin. My transgression would be sealed up in a bag, and you would cover my iniquity. Now, there almost seem to be some contradictory statements here. Some things that seem to really heavily conflict with one another. First off, he begins by saying, as far as he's concerned, there is no resurrection from the dead. There is no, once you go into the grave, you stay there and you don't come out. Some have theorized that what he is denying is not the actual existence of a spiritual afterlife, but rather a physical bodily resurrection. That's possible. That's entirely possible. I tend not to lean towards that one because he seems to describe death in terms of not just sleep, which the New Testament will do, but also in terms of like a nothingness, a void, an emptiness. And it's not just here in chapter 14. He makes some interesting statements like that in chapter 7. He makes some interesting statements like that in chapter 16 as well. But at the very least, any New Testament reader would look at that and say, well, what about the resurrection? Now, that is to say that in the Old Testament, there is plenty of evidence for a bodily resurrection. And it was a commonly held belief among the Jews of the Old Testament that one day there would be a mass resurrection of the faithful to where they would be raised from the grave. David talks about this. Isaiah talks about this. Daniel hints at it subtly. But it was enough to where in Jesus' day, which is technically during the Old Testament period, pretty much the biggest spiritual debate of the day that split the Jewish people right down the middle was a debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees over what issue? Resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees believed in a literal bodily resurrection, whereas the Sadducees took a more metaphorical view and denied a physical bodily resurrection. And they even tried to get Jesus to weigh in on this a couple of times. And he basically says the Pharisees are right, but I'm not going to weigh in because they're also wrong about a lot of other stuff. And then he basically starts teaching on the resurrection, drawing special attention to his resurrection, which is yet to come. So it's not like that's not a commonly held Old Testament belief. How is it that Job doesn't believe any of that? And does he not believe any of it? Eddie, you got one? Yeah. Yeah, see, and that's the thing. Now, he's pointing out that you said in the next chapter, in chapter 15, do you have a verse? Four- 14. Here's what I have. Here's what I have. In 14 verse 12. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so a man lies down and rises not again. Now, you said you have it, so a man lies down and rises not again. Pure? Till, okay. And rises not again, till the heavens are no more, and he will not awake or be roused from his sleep. So that word till there, I think again, see, and that's the thing I'm pointing out here. It's unclear exactly how much he believes or what he doesn't believe. There's a way to read this to where he doesn't believe in any of it. And there's a way to read it where this is the depression talking, and he does believe in some of it, but maybe not to the extent that we do that we believe ourselves. This word till here, I want to talk about this. So a man lies down and rises not again, till the heavens are no more, he will not awake or be roused from his sleep. So this idea of he might be referring to the resurrection occurring at the end of time, that could be it. Or he could be referring to just kind of poetically the endless nature of this lack of resurrection. I would also point out that he's comparing himself to the tree and how the tree can seemingly be dead, but then suddenly sprout back up to life. And then he seems to say, I'm not like that. Now, I want to be clear about something here. I am not advocating for Job not believing in any kind of afterlife. Instead, what I'm trying to show you here is that this is one of the weird passages where he makes some statements that seem to indicate this lack of belief in it. But if we turn over to chapter 19, just a few chapters over, we see a different interpretation, perhaps. He says in verse 23, let's make sure I get this. Yeah, verse 23, he says, "Oh, that my words were written." Now, we talked about this actually just a little bit ago. "Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that the book were inscribed, or that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in a rock forever." Verse 25, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. After my skin has thus been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall" what? "See God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, not another. My heart faints within me. If you say, how will we pursue him? And the root of the matter is found in him. Be afraid of the sword, for wrath brings punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment." So here's some interesting words here. He says this word judgment, right? What does that make you think of? What's the first thing you think of when you hear that word, judgment? Judgment day, the judgment, right? So it's almost like Job is saying that he is expecting to one day not only go to his grave, but then after going to his grave, stand before God, who is going to sit over him in judgment. And then he'll be able to make his case to God. He said, that's when I'll be able to stand before God and say, I would like to ask you, why did all this happen? Why am I here? Why did my life end in such misery? That's almost entirely keeping with the general Christian idea of how judgment works. Remember what Paul says? He says it in Corinthians. He makes similar statements in Romans where he says that the deeds of every man he will be held accountable to by who? God, right? But here's the rub. This is kind of why we start with this one, because it's a little bit of an easier one. Here's the rub. Couple of things. Number one, Job is operating on a very, very different mechanism concerning interaction with God. Some have said that what he's referring to there, in my flesh I shall see God, I shall stand before him, is what's going to happen at the end of the book. Because God shows up in the whirlwind, right? And he shows up, and there's Job, and there's God, and they have a conversation. Job only has a few lines in the conversation, but it is a conversation. There is a little bit of a back and forth that he's referring to that. And another author I read recently pointed out that this wouldn't be a severely strange thought for Job, because Job, living in the patriarchal age, if he has the same kind of relationship prior to the events of the book that Abraham has with God, guess what? Abraham has one-on-one conversations with God every other chapter in Genesis. And if it's in the same period, it wouldn't be strange for Abraham to go out, look up, and start talking and hear God talk back. But the interesting phrasing here is that he says, in my flesh, I shall see God. Why does he mention flesh? It almost sounds like what he's talking about is he and God both bodily being in the same room. And it could be argued that what's going on with Abraham in Genesis and Moses in Exodus is not a one-to-one conversation where they're both in the same room. It's instead where Moses is on the mountain and he hears God talking. It's more like a telephone call than it is like a one-on-one, in-person, like over a cup of coffee conversation. But that's what Job seems to be asking here. So that's the first thing. The language is somewhat muddled. It's somewhat contradictory. You could pack up your house and pitch your tent on either one of these positions, and you'd have wood for the fire. You'd have wood for the fire, meaning you could stay there because there's evidence for both. And I can tell you, after reading several books on Job, N.T. Wright says one thing, and Jim McGuigan says something completely different. And when they're asked this question, and to be honest with you, that was what leads us to the second important point to draw from this first weird issue. This is a prime example why it is all but impossible to derive clear theology from a poetic book. It is almost impossible, with a couple of very slight examples in the Psalms and in Proverbs, to derive exactly clear doctrine and theology from books of poetry, because it's very possible that there's a third option. We seem to think that there's only two options, making this a dilemma. You guys know what a dilemma is, right? Where you've got a problem with two potential solutions. And the dilemma is to choose which one is correct. Now, there are two ways to solve a dilemma, interestingly, ironically. Two problems, two solutions. To pick one to solve this problem with two solutions. The first is you can pick A or B. You can say A is right and B is wrong, or you can say B is right and A is wrong. That's option number one. Number two is something that philosophers refer to as breaking the horns or splitting the horns of a dilemma by inserting a potential third option. Because if there are three options, it's no longer a dilemma. I believe that this could potentially be, this is the one I like, by the way, the solution to this particular dilemma. Here's the dilemma. Does Job believe in an afterlife? Question mark. Option A is he doesn't, because God hasn't told him. And we know for a fact that living in the patriarchal age with no written word and no organized religion before God, if God chooses not to tell him something, does Job know it? No, he doesn't. That's how it worked with Abraham. That's how it worked with all of God's chosen representatives, all the way up to Moses when he shows Moses these carved tablets of stone. That's when it stops. So, the first one is that he doesn't believe in an afterlife. That's option A. Option B is that he does believe in an afterlife, because maybe God told him about it. If it's likely that God didn't tell Job about an afterlife, it must also be just as likely that he did. Is there any way of knowing? No. So, which one is it? Which one is it? Well, let's discuss option C. Option C is we don't know, but it's more than likely Job is just being really, really emotional. Do people say things that they don't mean about things like death and afterlife and future final destination, in spite of what they may or may not believe, in moments of high pressure, anxiety, and emotion? Absolutely. Have you done that? Raise your hand if you've done that. I've done that. Where you whitewash an outcome or you completely abandon long-held theology because you're not feeling up to it at the moment. That one seems the most likely to me. Do I know for certain if Job fully believes exactly as we do? I really doubt he believes exactly as we do. But is it possible that he believes in some semblance of what we do? Yes, because he does seem to make at least some random kind of reference to it in his clear moments, like in chapter 19. But it doesn't matter. Option C is that it doesn't matter because we just need to recognize the fact that he is being severely emotional. Okay. Now, for this last one, before we close and go into some discussion and I take some of your comments here, we're going to have to go over to near the end of the book in Job 40. Now, this is God talking to Job. We're jumping ahead a little bit. Here's the weird one. Are there dinosaurs in the book of Job? Now, God makes specific reference to a variety of animals here in chapter 39. He talks about donkeys. He talks about mountain goats. He talks about colts, horses. He talks about the ostrich, the wild ox. He talks about a variety of natural animals that you and I are more than familiar with. But he talks about two that stand out from the bunch. The first one is in chapter 40, verse 15, this beast that he calls Behemoth. Verse 15 of chapter 40 says, God says, "Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring him near his sword, for the mountains yield food for him, where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lives, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade of the lotus trees cover him, the willows of the brooks surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident through the Jordan rushes against my mouth. Can anyone take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare?" He goes on to describe his bones as tubes. I can't remember if it's here or not. But he talks about his bones being tubes of bronze, all sorts of things. Now, some, the more cynical, the less fanciful, I should say, biblical scholars will look at this and say, this is not a dinosaur. In fact, do you have a footnote next to Behemoth? Does anybody have a footnote next to Behemoth in verse 15? I've got one. Mine just says a large animal, exact identity unknown. Some might say, does anybody have hippopotamus? Okay. Okay. What's a hippo? Is a hippo a herbivore? Yes. Does it live in a river? Yes. Is it afraid when the river gets nasty? No. Is a hippo easy to take down, especially if you don't have access to firearms? Yes, incredibly difficult. In fact, did you know that hippos in Africa kill more people than lions do every year? You probably won't get eaten by a lion, but it's entirely possible if you're on a river at any point in Africa, you might get killed by a hippo. They're pretty aggressive. However, others might read this and say, that doesn't sound like a hippo to me. Here's what it says about his tail in verse 17. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar, and the sinews of his thighs are knit together. What's a cedar? a tree. Does that make you think of a big tail or a little tail? Do hippos have big tails? No, they don't. They have those tiny little tails, right? Verse 18, his bones were made of tubes of bronze. That's an interesting point. Did you know that one of the reasons why dinosaurs were able to get so big and be as large as some of them were is because, that's a lot of weight to carry around, right? But did you know that some of them mitigate this weight issue the same way birds do by having hollow bones? Dinosaur bones are hollow, like a bird's are hollow. Did you know that? In verse 18, what are the bones called?
Tubes.
What's the defining feature of a tube?
Hollow.
Being hollow. Some have pointed out and say, that sounds like a dinosaur bone to me. And it sounds like it sounds like a much bigger animal. Then he goes on to describe chapter 41, verse 1, this much more dramatic animal called Leviathan. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of man is false. He is laid low even in the sights of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me, who has first given to me that I should repay him? Who is under the whole heaven is mine. Verse 12, I will not keep silence concerning his limbs or his mighty strength or his goodly frame. Who could strip off his outer garment? Who can come near with him with a bridle? Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth is terror. His back is made of rows of shields, shut up tight closely with the seal. So one is near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined to one another. They clasp each other and cannot be separated. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils come forth smoke, as from a boiling pot, and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and flame comes forth from his mouth. He goes on. For sake of time, we're going to stop there. So, I also have a footnote next to Leviathan. I have unknown creature. Again, does anybody have crocodile? Okay, Abraham's got crocodile. So again, the more cynical would say, it's a crocodile. And you know what? That actually does make a little bit of sense. Did you know that crocodiles today, pretty big, I think like as big as they get today, Nile crocs can get about 20 feet long, 25 feet long, from nose to tail, tip of tail. But way back in the day, we found bones of crocodiles that were the size of school buses. That's a pretty crazy animal, right? They're scary now. Imagine them being the size of a school bus. If it's possible that this is some gigantic croc that could potentially some crocodiles live in salt water. So, it's possible. There are ocean crocodiles. I know that freaked me out the first time I learned about it too. There are ocean crocodiles, and it would match the scales being on its back being like a row of shields, the teeth being terror. Don't go in there. Can you imagine having to kill a crocodile with spears? That's not something you'd want to do again, right? Because they're quick and they're nasty, and one bite's all it's going to take. But others will say, this seems much bigger than even a school bus. It goes on to talk about size. Then it talks about how this thing can breathe fire. Can crocodiles breathe fire? No. So what do we have here? This sounds actually more than, I've heard 3 different options on this one. It's a crocodile, it's a dinosaur, or it's a dragon. It's a straight up sea dragon, right? It's a sea serpent, like something out of Norse mythology. Which ones? I don't know. I got to tell you, the dinosaur one gives me a little pause. It does. My tendency here is to take the more rational, the more poetic position to think that this is somewhat poetic license from God. Now, someone will say, but Jarrod, he talks about regular animals. He talks about colts. He talks about wild oxes. He talks about donkeys. Why would he go from literal animals to figurative animals? I get that. That's a problem with my position. That's a definite problem with my position that I would have to find some way to rectify that I can't. But he's talking in verse. He's talking in verse. And his point here is, I don't think he's lying to Job. I don't think that's the point. Because, again, it's a poem. If we read a poem like a history book, we're going to lose the intention of the poem. Poems, by nature, are metaphorical. If they're not metaphorical, they stop being poems. It's kind of, part of the game. Is it possible that he's talking about a dinosaur? Yes. Proponents of young earth creationism, which is the belief that the earth isn't anywhere near as old as evolutionary biology and geology, say it is, which is fair. It's a fair position to take. Taking a very, very ultra conservative view of the time details, not of the Bible, but of the time details within Genesis, taking the genealogies as a governance of time, dating the earth somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years old. This is one of the verses that people in the camp like to bring out. And I got to say, there's some weight there. There absolutely is. Because if the earth is that young, then there has to be a time when man and dinosaur were together. Another way to look at it is that he is hyping up some other animal that you and I would be somewhat at least familiar with. Because I got to be honest with you, most young earth creationists who believe in the existence of dinosaurs in the Bible place them pre-flood. And I am almost 150% certain that Job is not a pre-flood book. It is a post-flood book, taking place sometime during the later chapters or the middle chapters of Genesis, after the Tower of Babel and all of that. If that would be the case, then the really big stuff, except for maybe a water dinosaur here that it's talking about, would have been killed off by the flood. So you see there are some problems here. So what's the answer? Same as the first one. We don't know. It's possible, but it's a poem. So it's important to not get too wrapped up in the details. I understand that this part of this lesson, and I've done this enough times as we close because we're about 10 minutes over. I've done this class enough times to know that this is the lesson that people find particularly frustrating. Because if there's one thing we like, it's answers. It's definite answers to questions. What happened? Where did it happen? What did it mean? The who, what, where, when, and why. We want to know all that. But here's the issue. Job is not written with those questions in mind at all. No poem is. Not really. How many of you have read the Iliad? Anybody ever read the Iliad? The story of the Trojan War. It's the prequel to the Odyssey. Okay? You saw the movie? If you've seen the movie Troy, there's a little bit of that in there. Okay? It's about the Iliad. It's the story of the war between the Aegean Greeks and the Trojans. The Trojan horse and all of that, and Achilles and Hector and all that goodness, Agamemnon. It's a poem. Now, many historians believe, that there was a real city named Troy, called Troas probably in Revelation, interestingly enough, built on the site of old Troy, that sometime during the Bronze Age, went into war with Greece and was destroyed. But does Homer write his poem in order to give you a detailed historical account of how that happened? No. No. He is romanticizing an historical event for philosophical and emotional effect. So he puts in this whole idea of Helen of Troy, the face that could launch 1,000 ships, and being stolen away from her husband, the Spartan king, by Paris of Troy, launching this great war all over the theft of a beautiful woman. And then you've got demigods involved, and you've got actual Greek gods get involved, and they get down there. Did Troy happen? Did the Trojan War happen? More than likely. Did any of that happen? Not necessarily. But a lot of it was taken as poetic license. Why? Because the point is not the details that specifically took place, the who, what, where, when, and why. The important part is that you're supposed to walk away with a certain feeling about the nature of that war. Job does have some who, what, where, when, and why. I want to clarify something because I know I'm going to get some questions about it. Jarrod, are you saying that Job is largely metaphorical? I'm saying it is metaphorical. I don't think it's largely metaphorical because it can't be a poem without being metaphorical. If it's not metaphorical, it's not a poem, and we're reading it completely wrong. What I am saying is that there is in Job some who, what, where, when, and why. Job was a real person. I believe Satan and God really did have a conversation about him. God decided to use Job for his own benefit. I believe that the three friends are real people. Elihu is a real person. And a real debate took place. I doubt very much, because I don't know if you've ever been around four people having an argument about religious doctrine. Anybody? Was it this well structured? Or was it more of like a free-for-all, interrupting each other, biting each other's heads off? I think it was probably more like that. I do believe God shows up at the end. I do believe that he has a conversation with Job. I even think that largely, most likely, the flowery language we see in Job is, I don't even have a problem with it being even verbatim what they said. But we have to understand what we're reading. If you go into Job looking for answers, you're looking in the wrong book. You want answers? Go read Genesis. Read Leviticus. Leviticus it's chock full of answers. It's a little dry, but it's chock full of answers. The point here is, folks, the imagery here is meant to fill you with awe and wonder and at times confusion. Job's issues on the afterlife are very confused, which should make you feel like Job is confused. Is Job confused? Very, very much so. God's discussion of Leviathan and Behemoth are supposed to fill you with awe and wonder of the unknown and how majestic God is. If God can make things like this, how big must God be? That's the idea. That's what you're meant to walk away with. I'll tell you what, when you get to heaven, you can ask God directly about what these things are. And I'm sure he'll answer, but for now, that's the best we have. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and say goodnight. Sorry if we went over time a little bit, but there's a lot to get to tonight.